So today I just want to talk to you about inclusion through a neurodiversity lens. Neurodiversity is a term that's being used very often nowadays, particularly in school environments where we're really needing to assess our values around inclusion and how we're really able and willing to make spaces that are truly inclusive for all children of all abilities. And that includes neurodiversity and different neurotypes. I always say that when we look in nature, we see biodiversity, and an ecosystem is defined as strong and resistant and resilient if we see lots of biodiversity. Different organisms, different animals, fauna, flora, all working together to make a system healthy. Well, the human race is the same. We have diversity which strengthens us. We often prefer or give preference to people who are able-bodied, but that's all changing because disability rights are human rights, and people with disabilities, whether those are physical or learning disabilities or neurodiversity, all have something very important to bring to the world and need to be seen for who they are as more than their differences from the majority neurotype or neurotypical people or able-bodied people, but also as people who, while different, bring significant strengths to the table. So when we think about neurodiversity in particular, we're thinking about brains that are wired differently. When we think about autism, for example, research shows us that there are no localized abnormalities in the autism brain. It is basically just a brain that is wired differently to begin with and then continues to develop differently. Generally, up until now, when we think about neurodiversity, we think about autism, ADHD, learning disabilities, mental health, developmental coordination disorder, and so on. And so when we mention those labels, we often think about disabilities, the things that these types of people or people who have these labels find difficult. These are the children in the classroom who don't cooperate, who don't comply, who need extra time and attention, who can at times make teachers' lives more difficult. The children where we need to think much more carefully about what their needs are, because their needs are different to the rest of the classroom or the majority of the classrooms. Along with some of those challenges that people who are neurodivergent experience, there are also many strengths. There are strengths for autistic people, ADHD people, people with learning disabilities that often get overlooked because we focus so much on what's difficult for them. This tendency to see everything that's different from the norm as a problem or as a deficit or as inferior is called ableism. So ableism is this belief that people who are neurotypical, able-bodied people, the majority neurotype, are somehow superior to others, and that people with autism and ADHD and other neurodivergences really need to be trained and taught how to be more like neurotypical people, because that will mean that they are better functioning or doing better in the world. This is not the case, and the neurodiversity movement really advocates for this, is that being neurodivergent just means different. You have different needs, different strengths, different challenges, and really you can't be compared to a neurotypical person because it's like comparing apples and bananas. Both are fruit, but both are very, very different. If you like apples more than what you like bananas, it doesn't mean that apples are inferior to bananas, or if more people like apples, that doesn't mean that bananas are inferior. It just means they're different, right? And each have their own strengths that they bring. They need their own environments to thrive in. If we expect a banana to thrive in an apple's environment, that's probably not going to work, but that doesn't mean the banana is failing. It means the environment is failing. When neurodivergent children are expected, and as they are expected to be in environments that are predominantly geared for neurotypical people, that causes them immense stress. So they're having to work against their neurology a lot of the time to be able to fit into an environment that's built for neurotypical people. And this is very problematic, and it has significant impact on children and adults' mental health, because exposure to long-term chronic stress severely impacts mental health. And then we're looking at children's mental health in general that is deteriorating. Depression and anxiety, episodes of depression and anxiety are much more prevalent now, particularly in the wake of COVID. We're seeing many children struggling, and significant episodes of depression and anxiety is really as a result of prolonged exposure to toxic stress. All stress isn't bad. Productive stress is needed, is the type of stress that is needed to be able to mobilize us to get things done. It helps us to expand our environments, expand what we're capable of, whereas toxic stress is the type of stress where there's no way out. There's no growth. There's no light at the end of the tunnel. There's a sense of a loss of control, lack of agency. It's long-lasting, and it leads to being in a cycle of low energy and high tension. And toxic stress that leads to episodes of depression and anxiety really means that a person later on in life, particularly if these episodes occur during early childhood or during adolescence, when the brain is rapidly changing and developing, it means that these people are much more likely to have severe mental health issues or significant mental health issues as they go into adulthood and beyond. So looking at stress, looking at depression and anxiety in children is really important in terms of thinking about the well-being of the next generation. And the reality of the situation is, while this is incredibly worrying, and it's heartbreaking to think that children are having such a hard time just being okay in the world right now, this is the norm for neurodivergent children for the most part. Neurodivergent children live in environments that aren't geared for their processing style, the way that they think. Support is often not available, not targeted enough, not focused enough on what exactly the underlying need is. And so children are experiencing toxic stress because they're neurodivergent and living in a neurotypical world. So neurotypical children are struggling, and neurodivergent children are struggling, and they've been struggling for a long time. And we really need to start paying attention, because the longer-term mental health impact, or the longer-term mental health of neurodivergent people, gives us very poor statistics and poor results. So we know that what's happening isn't working. Children aren't coming out of the education system feeling empowered, feeling strong, feeling equipped to deal with what life will throw at them. So when we think about learning and how all brains come to learning, we're thinking about, because this is what's significant in the school environment and what we need to be aware of, is we need to think about regulation first. We're used to children coming into school being ready to learn. That isn't really the case for a neurodivergent child, and is often not the case for children in the wake of COVID anymore either. Children require a little bit more care and a little bit more intention in how they're approached to make sure that they're primed for learning, which is why they're in school to begin with. But when we think about becoming ready to learn, we think about 4 stages. The first is being regulated at the base of the brain stem and the midbrain regulation. What do I need? Am I hungry? Am I tired? Do I need movement? Are my sensory needs met? What feels calming to me? We know that for neurodivergent children, autistic children in particular, children with sensory processing disorder, there's a general sense of discomfort in their body. The way in which information comes into the brain, it's not organized, it doesn't necessarily make sense, and it often can send children into a stress response. They often require stronger input through certain channels and less input in other channels, and sometimes a combination of both. So understanding a child's sensory needs and a child's movement needs and meeting those needs is an essential step, an essential piece of the puzzle of helping that child to be ready to learn. Expecting a neurodivergent child to be learn when they walk into the classroom is an unrealistic expectation. There are going to be some needs that need to be met, and we're going to start with the base of the brain, and that is the senses, the body, the movement. The next step is emotional regulation. Who can I trust? Who sees me? And with whom do I feel safe? right? Neurodivergent children, children with chronic stress, developmental trauma, those kids need a safe person, a safe relationship. They need to know, and they need to be given consistent messages of safety from consistent adults. For a neurotypical child, it's easy. What we were used to in the olden days, maybe it was easier. A smile, a touch of the shoulder, a quick hug can calm a child instantly, can really send that child back into their place of safety. The opposite is true for neurodivergent children. It's not that easy. It's not that easy for that brain to feel safe. That brain is a hypersensitive nervous system. It's run by a hypersensitive nervous system, and that nervous system has a well-trodden path into the alarm system of the brain. And so it's not that easy to feel safe. And so we need to take a little bit of extra time and a little bit of extra, there needs to be a little bit of more thinking around how can I make this child feel seen and safe by me? And that doesn't need to take a whole lot of time, and it doesn't mean that child needs one-on-one support the whole entire day to feel safe, but there needs to be thinking and intention, and different childs have different needs. Different children have different needs. And then thirdly, there's social and cognitive engagement, right? That is once the brainstem regulation is in place and the emotional regulation is in place, it's only then that a child becomes available for social and cognitive engagement. This is where the thinking, the problem solving happens. This is where a child can endure and should be exposed to some productive stress. Only when this is in place will we get to educating brain states and build self-awareness. This is the level where we can have self-awareness around body changes, strategies that up or down regulate your body, being aware of changes, which will give you a call to action to do something about your stress or the feelings in your body. And these are the social emotional learning aspects. We often have goals for children very, very early on, at an early age, self-regulation goals. Ask for a break when you need it, take active steps from your self-regulation toolbox to regulate your system. This is something that a child who doesn't have these prior 3 levels in place is not really capable of doing. And we need to be aware of whether the expectations that we're setting of children are in fact realistic. Are our learning expectations realistic if this child isn't feeling safe in his body and isn't feeling safe in relationships? Are the self-regulation goals we have for this child realistic when a child is really functioning at the base of the brain, just trying to stay safe in their body and trying to feel safe within their senses? So I hope that this visual kind of gives you an idea of where are our students at from a day-to-day basis? Where is our understanding at on a day-to-day basis with what children are facing in the world today? And can we assume children are just ready for learning? So it's really important to understand stress and self-regulation when we're thinking about supporting neurodivergent children. Neurodivergent children are under an immense amount of stress all day, every day. And we need to think about how we understand stress and how do we support that so that we can get onto a better and more healthy level of self-regulation. So think about stress as a thermostat. This thermostat is set at 21 degrees. That is when the body, the brain, the nervous system is at its perfect temperature, its equilibrium, homeostasis. That's where we want to be. Every time something happens that takes the temperature above 21 or below 21, however small that is, it could be a big thing, it could be a small thing, that nervous system body needs to burn fuel, kick into action, kick into gear to try to regulate that system again. So it's going to burn fuel every time something takes it out of homeostasis, out of equilibrium. So the child might get a little bit hungry, burns energy to get back, call to action, let's fix that. The child gets a little bit too cold, a little bit too hot. The child has, another child looks at them strangely and they don't know how to interpret it. There's a social stressor. The child might be worried about their parents at home. There's an emotional stressor, and it burns energy to bring the child back to equilibrium. The child might be taught in a way, in an auditory way, where he's expected to listen, and really that's not the way that his brain is wired. He really needs to touch materials to learn, or he needs to see things in front of him to learn. He needs to have a multisensory experience. Now he's working extra hard to only focus on this auditory input as a way to try to learn, and he burns significant resources doing that because he's trying to keep up in the classroom. So when you think about it like that, you really get to see that systems can get out of balance. We can really burn a lot of energy all day, us as adults, as well as the kids in the class, and particularly neurodivergent students. And they're constantly using energy to try to be okay, to try to keep their system okay. Because nobody wants to have a big blowout. Nobody wants to have a big meltdown, because that doesn't make anybody feel good. So really, all the energy goes into trying to be okay. And if we see a child is no longer okay, then we know, well, that empty tank we've reached the empty tank, right? So we need to think about self-control versus self-regulation. Are we just expecting children to control themselves and control their nervous systems to be okay and comply and do as they're told and listen and learn when they're in the classroom? Versus, are we giving them the tools by understanding what their stressors are, and also understanding what we need to give them to fill up their fuel tank again, so that there's more of a self-regulatory system going on, as opposed to self-control, which burns even more energy, right? With self-control, we have to try harder, we burn more energy, there's even more depletion. Whereas with self-regulation, there's a lot more thinking, a lot more of an approach towards achieving balance in this child's body and in this child's day, so that they can actually do better. So we need to learn what is draining the resources, like what would be draining your resources as an adult, because your self-regulation is important as well, but what's also draining the resources on the child's part. We need to know, does this child have sensory processing differences that drains their resources? How do we fill their tank after that? Does this child have learning differences? Does this child have a tendency to feel unsafe, left out, isolated? Does this child have a sensitivity to complex sounds? Does this child get overwhelmed by visual stimulation? Draw the team in, get to understand this child's unique profile, and figure out what are the things that are draining this child's resources on an ongoing basis across all of these fields: body, emotional, cognitive, and social. And then try to reduce some of those stressors. If we can create a quieter, less visually stimulating environment, why can we not just create that and just cut that stressor out, make it easier? We can reduce a number of stressors just by being aware of them. We need to become stress detectives. We need to think about why and why now. Why are we seeing this kind of behavior? What could be causing that kind of behavior? What's happening in this child's environment right now? And what has happened into this child's environment earlier on in the day? Where were the energy drains? Am I dealing with an empty tank right now? And then think about regulate. We need to become the expert in children's regulatory strategies, right? We need to know what helps this system to calm, what helps the system to up and down regulate in a way that supports the learning, supports the regulation, supports that energy consumption, and fills up the tank again. We need to find some in-the-moment strategies when a child is having a really hard time, to support them in a way that makes sense to their brain and to their system, and it's a direct avenue to calm. And we also need to know about restorative strategies, long-term strategies, the way we schedule a child's day, the types of experiences we expose a child to on a daily basis, which accounts for the stressors that will be a natural part of the day, but then also encompasses and includes, that helps to refill that tank again. Really, that really helps to keep the system balanced, so it's not just getting fully empty. There are constantly an inflow of experiences and activities that will fill up that tank again. So that gives us that self-regulation. There will always be stressors, and the stressors will come up, but we'll come back down again, and we'll mitigate those stressors with restorative activities. So this is really a paradigm shift in which we think that all kids do well if they can. All kids will do well if they can. And if they're not doing well, there's a reason for that. It's not that a child is deliberately obstructive or non-compliant. If a child is consistently failing to meet expectations, it means that there's more to the story. And we need to dig a little deeper instead of just trying to push this child to get to that place of compliance, give them rewards, give them anything we can think of just to motivate them to get the outcome that we want. And in so doing, disregarding the unmet need, the skills that aren't yet in place, the supports that this child would need to meet said expectation. So instead of asking, how can I get this child to do what I want? Ask, what does this child need? We always need to look with soft eyes to ourselves and to the kids that we work with. People do well if they can. And if we're not doing well, if you're not doing well as a teacher, if you're not doing well as a parent, if your child isn't doing well, there's something that's getting in the way, because we are innately driven to do well. So we need to reframe some of the behaviors that we see. We need to reframe non-compliance, repetition of mistakes, failure to sit still, failure to work independently. All of these, not listening, physical intrusiveness, poor social judgment, all of these behaviors can be reframed, and we can look at it as a child who has trouble meeting the expectation, either because they don't yet have the developmental skills to meet the expectation, or because they don't have the support in place to be able to meet the demand that is set on them. This is a good example of how to look at children with troublesome behaviors as we say in school. The ADHD iceberg. On top, we see fidgeting, we see getting distracted, we see impulsive behaviors, we see concentration issues. If we were able to look beneath the surface, we would see that this child has sleep issues, executive dysfunction, emotional dysregulation, information processing issues, relationship challenges, challenges in focusing, poor memory, poor time management. All of these could explain why a child is failing to meet expectations. It could also explain why a child has difficult behaviors, because can you imagine the frustration at seeing other people do things that you simply can't do? No matter how hard you try, you are letting people down, feeling like you're letting yourself down, because things that other people find easy doesn't come as easily to you. So there's so much more to the story. And I think when we understand what's beneath the surface, our eyes can soften and we can look at it through a different lens. We can adjust our expectations and we can adjust the type of support that we give to make it more likely for a child to feel successful. We can do something about that situation. Troubled or stressed kids are distinguished by their regrettable ability to elicit from others exactly the opposite of what they really need. This is a really important quote, because we'll often see with teachers go like, this child is the worst attitude. And you can see the teacher being triggered by the behaviors of the child, which is so counterproductive for that poor child who's really still doing the best that he can with what he has available, but it's not eliciting the response that he really needs. And I think it's so important that we as adults recognize that we have the more mature brain. We're the ones who can kind of zoom out and look at a situation with a bit of a more of an independent eye. If we can allow ourselves to pause before we react, if we can take a breath, if we can think about what we're thinking about and what we're feeling in the moment, we can be much more measured, much more productive, thoughtful, and responsive in the situations when children need that from us most. And again, coming back to, for example, ADHD in this example, it's not just about the challenges. This child might be hyperactive, distractible, impulsive, but he's also passionate, outspoken, strategic, fun, generous, opinionated, intuitive, positive, honest, has hyper-focused, imaginative, smart, energetic. When we're only stuck on seeing the behaviors that we don't want to see, that creates work for us and creates the opportunity, I would say, for us to think about how we need to respond, requires some self-examination and adjustment in our attitudes and our behavior, then we will see everything else that this beautiful brain, this beautiful child, if supported, can bring to the world, which is such a gift and so needed. Every child has a gift that has to come out into the world because he's here for that reason and it's needed. So In short, we're basically looking at neurodiversity, neurodivergent children's support needs, sensory safety, movement as needed, emotional support through connection and co-regulation, and learning support. Those are going to be the 4 areas where the focus has to be when we think about how do we support neurodivergent learners. And when we think about inclusion, we're going to have to accept the fact that inclusion requires an individualized response. We need to think about giving children a sense of belonging that makes sense to them, acceptance for what they bring and who they are, despite that being different, or actually because that is different, support according to the needs that they have. Cookie cutter approaches to support doesn't work. Cookie cutter approaches to connection doesn't work. Different children need different messages and different approaches, different ways in which you hold your body, different ways in which you speak, a different way of using language, a difference in your tone of voice to be able to feel that connection. Participation is different for different students. Equality, togetherness, access, all of these need to be thought about when we think about students with neurodiversity in our schools. So in closing, every child's mental health matters. This includes neurotypical children and it includes neurodivergent children. And it's time for us to recognize that neurodivergent children have experienced significant stress, continuous, long-lasting, toxic stress because of a lack of education and a lack of awareness in the neurotypical institutions and agencies around their needs and around their support needs and around their strengths and around how to be truly inclusive. Every child needs to feel a sense of control and agency in their life to be well. It's so important for children to feel like they have a say and that they are able to participate and they're able to contribute in a way that makes sense to them, that they don't need to pretend to be like somebody else or only do things that are of value to a different person and that has no meaning to them. Children need to feel a sense of control and agency. This is super important for their mental health. We as adults need to choose our hard. We're either going to have a hard time trying to manage behaviors if we're not willing to address underlying needs, or we're going to have a hard time understanding, adapting, and finding ways to meet the support needs of neurodivergent students. We can choose our hard. We can either be proactive and start to take small steps towards true inclusion and true support for neurodivergent children, or we can continue to struggle not meeting children's needs, feeling frustrated in our work, feeling frustrated by the diversity and complexity of needs in our classrooms, and yet affecting no change. And then in the back of your mind, always knowing that neurodivergent children are suffering because of the lack of awareness and lack of support, particularly in the classroom. The adults working with children and the parents need attention and care too. When we think about self-regulation versus self-control, the principle applies to everybody. It applies to teachers and parents as well. We need to think about what are our regulation needs, what are our stressors, how can we reduce some of the stressors that we know about and that we can reduce, and how can we mitigate the others? Do I know what I enjoy, what lifts me up, what gives me a restorative experience? Or do I revert to just sitting on the couch and scrolling through my phone as a way of distraction? That's not going to restore your nervous system. It's giving you an escape, but it's not bringing you back to equilibrium. It's adding to the stress and the overstimulation. We need to be really thoughtful and think about, what do I need at school? What do I need as a break? What do I need from my colleagues? How can we as an education team, how can parents support, create community? How can we support each other so that we have more restorative experiences and feel more supported when the stress starts to peak? Because we're all experiencing record levels of stress. It's increasingly difficult to take time out to get anything done. One thing added to your to-do list can be the thing that sends you over the edge because we're all at capacity. soft eyes to yourself, recognizing that you too are doing the best that you can with what you have, is incredibly important. And we can't give what we don't have. And so support to any student will be limited if we're not feeling supported as adults. This is really a group effort in the truest sense of the word. Thank you for the opportunity to talk to you a little bit about neurodiversity and inclusion. I'm happy to talk to you more, and here are my contact details on this last slide. So feel free to reach out if there's anything else I can help you with. I do have an extensive course for educators around understanding neurodiversity, autism in particular, with extensive explanations about the brain and also hands-on strategies that can be implemented in the classroom every day, but also ways to think about a longer-term vision for our staff team, for schools, to create a more inclusive and more supportive environment for all students in the classroom. I will add at this point that this is a good investment to make, because the research studies is clearly showing us that teaching to neurodivergent children and teaching to the needs of neurodivergent children and adjusting our teaching environments and teaching styles to suit neurodivergent children hugely benefits even the neurotypical students. So beginning to think about changing up our environments will benefit all students, all teachers. And so I hope that you will make that investment to create a better space, because all children's mental health matters.